Hi guys, it's Katya, Mrs. Van Zanten's real daughter, one of them. I'm going to read for you guys today, Chapter 5. Out of bounds at all times and no exceptions. There was only one thing for it, and that was to speak to Father. Father hadn't left Berlin in the car with them that morning. Instead, he had left a few days earlier, on the night of that day that Bruno had come home to find Maria going through his things, even the things he'd hidden at the back that belonged to him and were nobody else's business. In the days following, Mother, Gretel, Maria, Cook, Lars, and Bruno had spent all their time boxing up their belongings and loading them into a big truck to be brought to their new home at Outwith. It was on this final morning, when the house looked empty, and not like their real home at all, that the very last things they owned were put into suitcases, and an official car with red and black flags on the front had stopped at their door to take them away. Mother, Maria, and Bruno were the last people to leave the house, and it was Bruno's belief that Mother didn't realize the maid was still standing there, because as they took one last look around that empty hallway where they had spent so many happy times, the place where the Christmas tree stood in December, the place where the wet umbrellas were left in the stand during the winter months, the place where Bruno was supposed to leave his muddy shoes when he came in but never did, Mother had shaken her head and said something very strange. "We should never have let the fury come to dinner," she said. "Some people and their determination to get ahead." Just after she said that, she turned around and Bruno could see that she had tears in her eyes, and she jumped when she saw Maria standing there watching her. "Maria," she said in a startled tone of voice, "I thought you were in the car." "I was just leaving, ma'am," said Maria. "I didn't mean," began Mother, before shaking her head and starting again. "I wasn't trying to suggest—" "I was just leaving, ma'am," repeated Maria, who must not have known the rule about not interrupting Mother, and stepped through the door quickly and ran to the car. Mother had frowned, but then shrugged as if none of it really mattered anymore. Anyway. "Come on then, Bruno," she said, taking his hand and locking the door behind them. "Let's just hope we get to come back here someday when all this is over." The official car with the flags on the front had taken them to a train station, where there were two racks separated by a wide platform, and on either side a train stood waiting for the passengers to board. Because there were so many soldiers marching about on the other side, not to mention the fact that there was a long hut belonging to the signalman separating the tracks, Bruno could only make out the crowds of people for a few moments before he and his family boarded a very comfortable train with very few people on it, and plenty of empty seats and fresh air when the windows were pulled down. If the trains had been going in different directions, he thought, it would have seemed so odd. But they weren't. They were both pointed eastwards. For a moment he considered running across the platform to tell the people about the empty seats in his carriage, but he decided not to, as something told him that if it didn't make Mother angry, it would probably make Gretel furious, and that would be worse. Since arriving at Outwith and their new house, Bruno hadn't seen his father. He had thought perhaps he was in his bedroom earlier when the door creaked open, but that had turned out to be the unfriendly young soldier who had stared at Bruno with any warmth in his eyes. He hadn't heard Father's booming voice anywhere, and he hadn't heard the heavy sound of his boots on the floorboards downstairs. But there were definitely people coming and going, and as he debated what to do for the best, he heard a terrific commotion coming from downstairs and went out to the hallway to look over the banister. Down below he saw the door to Father's office standing open and a group of 5 men outside it, laughing and shaking hands. Father was at the center of them, and looked very smart in his freshly pressed uniform. His thick dark hair had obviously been recently lacquered and combed, and as Bruno watched from above, he felt both scared and in awe of him. He didn't like the look of the other men quite as much. They certainly weren't as handsome as Father, nor were their uniforms as freshly pressed, nor were their voices so booming or their boots so polished. They all held their caps under their arms and seemed to be fighting with each other for Father's attention. Bruno could only understand a few of their phrases as they traveled up to him. Made mistakes from the moment he got here. It got to the point where the Fury had no choice but to, said one. Discipline, said another, and efficiency. We have lacked efficiency since the start of 42, and without that, it's clear what the numbers say. It's clear, commandment, said the third. And if we build another, said the last, imagine what we could do then. Just imagine it. Father held a hand in the air, which immediately caused the other men to fall silent. It was as if he was the conductor of a barbershop quartet. "Gentlemen," he said, and this time Bruno could make out every word because there had never been a man born who was more capable of being heard from one side of a room to the other than Father. "Your suggestions and your encouragement are very much appreciated, and the past is the past. Here we have a fresh beginning, but let that beginning start tomorrow. For now, I'd better help my family settle in, or there will be as much trouble for me in here as there is for them out there. You understand?" The men all broke into laughter and shook Father's hand. As they left, they stood in a row together like toy soldiers, and their arms shot out in the same way that Father had taught Bruno to salute. The palms stretched flat, moving from their chests up into the air in front of them, in a sharp motion as they cried out for the 2 words that Bruno had been taught to say whenever anyone said it to him. Then they left, and Father returned to his office, which was out of bounds at all times, and no exceptions. Bruno walked slowly down the stairs and hesitated for a moment outside the door. He felt sad that Father had not come up to say hello to him in the hour or so that he had been here. But it had explained to him on many occasions just how busy Father was and that he couldn't be disturbed by silly things like saying hello to him all the time. But the soldiers had left now, and he thought it would be all right if he knocked on the door. Back in Berlin, Bruno had been inside Father's office on only a handful of occasions, and it was usually because he had been naughty and needed to have a serious talking to. However, the rule that applied to Father's office in Berlin was one of the most important rules that Bruno had ever learned, and he was not so silly as to think that it would not apply here at Outwith too. But since they had not seen each other in some days, he thought that no one would mind if he knocked now, and so he tapped carefully on the door, twice and quietly. Perhaps Father didn't hear. Perhaps Bruno didn't knock loudly enough, but no one came to the door. So Bruno knocked again, and did it louder this time, and as he did so he heard the booming voice from inside call out, "Enter." Bruno turned the door handle and stepped inside and assumed his customary pose of wide-open eyes and mouth in the shape of an O, and arms stretched out by his sides. The rest of the house might have been a little dark and gloomy and hardly full of possibilities for exploration, but this room was something else. It had a very high ceiling to begin with, and a carpet underfoot that Bruno thought he might sink into. The walls were hardly visible. Instead, they were covered with dark mahogany shelves, all lined with books, like the ones in the library at the house in Berlin. There were enormous windows on the wall facing him, which stretched out into the garden beyond, allowing a comfortable seat to be placed in front of them, and in the center of all of this, seated behind a massive oak desk, was Father himself, who looked up from his papers when Bruno entered and broke into a wide smile. "Bruno," he said, coming round from behind the desk and shaking the boy's hand solidly, for Father was not usually the type of man to give anyone a hug, unlike Mother and Grandmother, who gave them a little too often for comfort, complimenting them with slobbering kisses. "My boy," he added after a moment. "Hello, Father," said Bruno quietly, a little overawed by the splendor of the room. "Bruno, I was coming up to see you in a few minutes. I promise I was," said Father. "I just had a meeting to finish and a letter to write. You got here safely then?" "Yes, Father," said Bruno. "You were a help to your mother and sister in closing the house?" "Yes, Father," said Bruno. "Then I'm proud of you," said Father approvingly. "Sit down, boy." He indicated a wide armchair facing his desk, and Bruno clambered onto it, his feet not quite touching the floor, while Father returned to his seat behind the desk and stared at him. They didn't say anything to each other for a moment, and then finally Father broke the silence. "So," he asked, "what do you think?" "What do I think?" asked Bruno. "What do I think of what?" "Of your new home. Do you like it?" "No," said Bruno quickly, because he always tried to be honest and knew that if he hesitated even for a moment, then he wouldn't have the nerve to say what he really thought. "I think we should go home," he added bravely. Father's smile faded only a little, and he glanced down at his letter for a moment before looking back up again, as if he wanted to consider his reply carefully. "Well, we are home, Bruno," he said finally in a gentle voice. "Outwith is our new home." "But when can we go back to Berlin?" asked Bruno, his heart sinking when Father said that. "It's so much nicer there." Come, said Father, wanting to have none of that. "Let's have none of that," he said. "A home is not a building or a street or a city or something so artificial as bricks and mortar. A home is where one's family is. Isn't that right?"